Georgia's been very fiscally conservative, as you know, for many years. And we have a AAA bond rating from all three rating services. We're only a handful of states that do that. We pass our budget each year without a lot of drama. We don't have a fiscal cliff negotiation. We don't have skyrocketing debt. So that means we're a great role model for fiscal responsibility. So no better place to start an effort to get our federal government under control than at the state level here at Georgia. And that's what we're talking about today, is an effort through Article 5 of the United States Constitution to pass a balanced budget amendment. Something we've been talking about. I was talking to Patrick earlier when Newt Gingrich was elected Speaker. They were talking about how much, in this very facility, how much we need to focus on passing a balanced budget amendment. But we've not gotten it done. And I think we've got a great window of opportunity to do that. In the Georgia legislature, there are 3 different bills that passed last week addressing this issue. Different approaches, each with their pros and cons, and we're going to discuss those today. We're very lucky to have with us a real expert on the subject, Nick Dranias. Nick holds the Clarence and Catherine Duncan Chair for Constitutional Government and is director of the Mueller Center for Constitutional Government at the Goldwater Institute, which is our sister think tank in Arizona. Before joining Goldwater, he worked for the Institute for Justice, another great organization. And I have been to many, many meetings on this very issue where we've had constitutional scholars like Nick discussing the threat of a runaway convention, the pros and cons of each of the approaches. How do we get something that can pass in the requisite number of states, that it can actually get done? And he has done a fantastic job at talking about those issues, and I'm convinced that the compact approach is the best approach. But that doesn't mean it's mutually exclusive. We can certainly pass all of the approaches and see what can pass in other states. But I think we all need to be more educated on this issue, and I can't think of a better person to do that. So please help me welcome Nick Dranias.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for making it out here. I understand there's a jackknife truck. So, it's more power to you. In a way, you're kind of living the founding era determination and persistence in making it. Now get ready for a fire hose, because we're going to be blasting at you some of the most complex history and law and constitutional authority that you've maybe heard in a long time. And so if it seems to be moving too fast or hitting you too hard, well, I'll have a question period, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions. But with that said, let me just emphasize, the Georgia Public Policy Foundation has been absolutely critical as an educational foundation in assisting this issue and moving this issue forward in Georgia and educating the population here. And we simply would not have had the success last week with all 3 bills without Georgia Public Policy Foundation involved. So all of your support for Georgia Public Policy Foundation is really making a difference. At the Goldwater Institute, we rely heavily on our sister organizations throughout the country. We can't get what we're doing done without them. And I have to say, of all of the different states that we've been engaged in, over a dozen, none have stood up like Georgia Public Policy Foundation has. No other state, by the way, has led like Georgia has on this issue. And I think it must be the fiscal responsibility that just is ingrained here. The reality is 49 states have some kind of balanced budget amendment or debt limit, either constitutionally or statutorily or by case law. Some are like California, but Georgia is definitely in the top 10, and it's not an accident of oil production like North Dakota. I mean, this is a culture that is unique, that is effective, that if the first state, the founding state for the compact were Georgia, it would be something we would all look back on with pride, no matter where we're from. And certainly rooting for Georgia. We have 3 states moving right now, Alaska and Arizona as well. We've got Arkansas on the table. We're waiting to see how it goes procedurally because they have a fiscal limit. Now, we wanted to keep this issue very small and focused because in order to found the compact, all we need is 2 states. And we want to make sure that all of the tweaks are made with the founding member states in this effort, so that then we have a platform for next year and the following year. And by the way, this is not just think tank, abstract, balderdash. We intend, with this campaign, to get to a balanced budget amendment in 3 years. 3 years. And it's not just because we like to set hard, heavy pushes. It's because I don't think, and our economists don't think, and many other reasonable people don't think, that we've got any hope of fixing the debt if we're not on a trajectory to a balanced budget amendment within 3 years. If we don't have at least the framework for a balanced budget amendment or a debt limit, then let's just write off the debt. And the reality is we will be defaulting. We will be following the path of Greece and Argentina. There just is no other trajectory that makes sense. But with that said, let me give you some optimism. Because it turns out that the founders anticipated this problem. You know, one of the things I got to worry about sometimes is I sound like I'm speaking in codes, you know, Article 5, you know, things like that. So let me just introduce you to Article 5. Article 5 is in the Constitution. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy among constitutionalists as to whether to use this power, but let me just highlight a small bit of cognitive dissonance. It's in the Constitution. If you're a constitutionalist, that should give you pause before opposing using what's in the Constitution. Now, Article 5 is not a model of perfect clarity. First of all, it's a very long sentence. You can tell that most of the founders were attorneys. There are definitely questions that can be asked about it. But another point that I like to make about being a constitutionalist is that it's our job to take the work of the founders and make it workable. You know, the founders never intended for the Constitution to provide its own text answers to every question. It was meant to be a framework, to be filled in through legislation, through court decisions, and through the benefit of experience and knowledge. It doesn't mean it evolves. It just means that it's a framework that wasn't meant to fill every single gap in and of itself. It was meant to provide the principles for filling those gaps. And there's no question, as you'll see in this presentation, that those principles are clear when you understand Article 5 in light of history and context. But first, let's just take a look at this. What is Article 5? Article 5 defines the power to amend the Constitution. And what's significant about this power, and what I like to lead off with, is that the same power that Congress has used 27 times, by the way, we're on Constitution version 27, okay? The same amendment power Congress has used 27 times is in the same provision, indeed the same sentence, as the state's power to originate amendments through convention. It's even deeper than that. Take a look at this language. Here is the portion that talks about the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states applying to Congress for a convention for proposing amendments. Notice that it's literally a clause in between the congressional proposal power and the ratification power. Look at the ratification requirement for any amendment is the same, 3/4 of the states. And it clearly is a clause that conditions both the congressional mode of proposing amendments and the state's mode of proposing amendments. Now, you know, some folks think that this is a red button of destruction. That you press this button, it blows up the Constitution. That it sidesteps the Constitution. That it's somehow an extra constitutional power that is in no way governed by this clause. Now, do you have to be Daniel Webster to see that that's ridiculous? I mean, don't we have to have give a little bit more credit to the founders that they could draft a clause to blow up the world if they wanted to? I mean, if they wanted to have this power sidestep the Constitution, have nothing to do with ratification, don't you think they could have taken this clause and put it into a different provision? They didn't. So just as an initial observation, look at the structure of the text. What I say to folks is, if the founders wanted for the convention process to sidestep the Constitution, to be able to bypass the ratification requirements, this is not how they would draft it. What we have is one amendment power that can be exercised in two different ways, clearly working within the scope of the Constitution, subject to the same ratification requirements. That being said, there's a lot of questions from this. I mean, what's an application? Does proposing amendments mean more than one? Does it mean, you know, when it says call the convention right here, does that mean Congress gets to structure it, populate it, run it like a puppet of its own self? I mean, these are questions that are legitimate because, you know what, that's about all there is to Article 5. There isn't, you know, subsection B with the rules and the agenda and so on. So we're going to talk about how a compact, an agreement among the states, fills all those gaps, and how in fact the founders intended for the states to work together and agree on filling those gaps, and that this is the solution to the problem that we have been looking at Article 5 for over 40 years, ever since Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan tried to push a balanced budget amendment through this process from the states. You're going to see that the compact approach, agreeing to everything in this process in advance and with specificity, is the answer. It's the only plausible way to get this process done, in my view, if you want to get to a balanced budget amendment before it's too late. If you want to go on a quest for 20 or 30 years and maybe get to something someday, we can do something else. But if you want to get to a balanced budget amendment, if you want to have a shot at getting to a balanced budget amendment when it's not too late, you're going to see that the compact is really the best way to go. Now, that being said, let's take a look at the problem. That is not hyperbole. That is our debt, our gross federal debt, by the way. I do not just look at the public debt, or the debt held by the public. That is bogus, because our credit rating in the private bonding markets is based on the totality of our obligations, whether we play games with Social Security obligations or not, whether we're borrowing from ourselves or not. The total amount of our debt capacity is based on the outstanding total amount of debt. And this is what's been happening to our debt. Now you're going to say, some people are going to say, maybe not in this room, we have the smart people in this room, but some people are going to say that, well, that doesn't matter. That's just nominal. That's just, money printing. I don't even like looking at inflation. I think the best measure of the scale of our debt problem is relative to what we produce every year, the gross domestic product. If you look at gross federal debt, the real debt number, we are where we were in 1942 in terms of burdening our economy. If you go to the U.S. national debt clock, it is 107% of GDP. We are literally where Greece was 6 years ago. By contrast, Italy is panicking at 130%, of GDP, and I don't even think, they had a prayer of getting out front of it, and we've only got about 3 years before we start hitting that European level of total despair. But I want to emphasize, some folks say, well, look, we grew out of the World War II era debt. No problem, we can grow out of it. What was different about the post-World War II era than today? We were the only economy standing. We rebuilt the world. So naturally we grew out of this. Are we the only economy standing today? Are we not about to be bypassed by maybe 2/3 of the world in Asia? I mean, this is not a reasonable growth trajectory. We cannot manage this debt with mere growth. That is nonsense. And what's different also about today is that we've already mortgaged the future. We have over, by some estimates, it ranges from 100 trillion to 220 trillion, but by the worst case scenario estimates, we have over $220 trillion in unfunded entitlement programs. And what does that mean? That means we've already mortgaged the future. We've already mortgaged more than the value of our entire country, many times over. So not only are we not in a position to grow like we did in the 50s, but we've already mortgaged the future. We've already claimed for our creditors and for our special interest groups and for our entitlement dependents all of that growth. It's already claimed. So we are literally at a point of no return. We do not have the luxury of just hoping that this will all just go away. Some folks are saying things are getting better. They're saying, well, gosh, last year was $1.1 trillion deficits. This year is $650 billion. It's not a problem. Look at the growth in the gross debt. It continues. Anytime you're over a couple $100 billion in deficits in this sort of trajectory against the backdrop of having all of our future mortgaged already by unfunded entitlement programs, against a backdrop where we've got rising powers in the East that are going to outstrip our economy, that are going to outcompete us, this is not sustainable. This is a calamity. I get this response sometimes from my more libertarian friends, maybe borderline anarcho-capitalists, which they're brothers, I love them. But some folks say, well, nah, we'll just default. No problem. And indeed, that may be the ultimate reality. I mean, I don't think we've got any way of turning this around beyond a 3-year horizon, maybe 4. But there is no cost-free default. I mean, Argentina defaulted over 10 years ago. They're still chased around the world by creditors, hedge funds. They're still boxed out of trade agreements. Their economy is completely in the doldrums. Like, ours looks great compared to what goes on in Argentina. And one of the worst tragedies, I'm not losing any sleep over their Air Force One almost getting seized. But one of the worst tragedies of Argentina is that 2 years in, after the default, they actually nationalized their equivalent of 401k system. They replaced everybody's real assets, real investments with worthless government bonds that they couldn't sell in the bond markets anymore. That's what happens in a default. And mind you, the federal government has the eminent domain power, and mind you, it has been used, the courts have sustained the use of seizing money for money under the eminent domain power. So there is no way that we are not going to face a similar risk if we default. That is our future. And the best thing I can say about the future is that maybe the Air Force One will be seized by creditors. Why did we get here? Well, the better question is, how can we not get here? Think about how ridiculous our current system is. The debtor gets to set his own credit limit without limit. Imagine if you ran a bank and somebody came to you and said, I'd really like a revolving line of credit that I set whenever I want it. And you said, okay, here you go. And then 5 years later, you're completely bankrupt, wondering why. How could it be any other way? How could we expect to see anything but the charts that we just saw when we are in a federal system that allows the debtor to freely set his own credit limit? Now, it's more than just sort of the common sense, practical recognition that this is ridiculous. There's a real problem in any system with democratic processes where you allow essentially politicians to borrow from non-voting future generations to shower benefit on current voting generations. There is no natural political accountability there, right? The people being burdened with the costs of the freebies don't even get to vote. The politicians generally do not have a time horizon beyond a few years. They don't know where they're going to be in 3 or 4 years. So they just keep doing it. Why would they behave differently? Now, there's going to be some folks in politics, maybe even most folks sometimes, that are solid moral character, they're going to act as a trustee for the future and the present. But if you create a system in which you allow the burdening of non-voting future generations through benefits to current generations, you're going to skew that system in favor of constantly burdening future generations because it will enhance the political careers of anyone in that system to do just that. So this is a problem of democracy. This is inherent to the structure of democracy. This is why 49 states have balanced budget amendments or debt limits, because in playing this out in the states in the 19th century, we saw that it collapses entire states. We saw all the subsidies and all the canals and all the railroads crash state after state after state, and then they finally realized, you know what, we maybe need a fundamental law to curtail this behavior. And believe it or not, the left and the right of the time converged on the same solution. This was not a left-right issue. This was the progressives and the classical liberals united. A recognition that whether you view this as a question of limited government or whether you view this as a democracy that truly takes into consideration the interests of everyone affected by what it does, you got to have a fundamental law limiting the debt. Now, someone's going to say, well, the founders, they left out any sort of debt limit for a reason. There must be some real, wisdom behind that. Like the Ark of the Covenant, we must never meddle with. The funny thing is that the founders never viewed the Constitution the way that we've come to view it, that it's absolutely perfect, that it was never got anything wrong. The founders were great men, no doubt about it. They're better men than anyone I know. But we have the benefit of standing on their shoulders and seeing trial and error in 50 states over dozens and dozens of decades. We can be complete mental midgets and see what the founders didn't see. But the truth is, the founders did see it. Thomas Jefferson barely 10 years into the experiment, was saying, the federal government's growing beyond its assigned roles, it's spending too much money, and the cause is borrowing. And there's just one thing we could do that would reduce it to its original founding principles. We're talking less than 10 years into the whole thing. We'd take away the power of borrowing. See, it's not rocket science to see how in a democratic system the ability to shoulder the costs of benefits on future non-voting generations will produce a tendency to grow. Because think about the political argument we principled conservatives have. The political argument is, be austere, limit, tighten your belt, save, wait for the future. And the other side is, I've got a replicator machine. What do you want? You got it. Is it any wonder that in a society that is not populated by 95% philosopher kings, we tend to lose that argument over time? And not only that, we tend to lose it until the system collapses, right? I mean, this will continue. The replicator machine versus Mr. Belt tightening. Replicator machine is going to beat that until the replicator machine is exposed as a fraud, which will only happen in the minds of the non-philosopher kings that we have to deal with in reality when the system crashes. So we have to step in front of that trajectory and fix the problem first. Here is the proposal at the heart of the compact for a balanced budget, which passed the House of Georgia last week, 103 to 63. It's on a trajectory to be passed in Alaska. It soon will be on the House floor in Arizona. This balanced budget amendment is not perfect. It's not perfect. For Article 5 to work, you've got to get to 38 states. There are only really 27 states there that we can count on doing something as good as the best we can find in the states. The rest, we got to finagle. We got to bring them over. We've got to have a product that can sell. That being said, we've poll tested every component of this balanced budget amendment, and supermajority support every component of it. That being said, this is a powerful, huge reform. Supermajorities will support this. It will be very difficult, even in the purple states, to reject this once we get the steamroll going. First, let's stop playing games with budgets. We have to start thinking of a balanced budget in terms of a spending limit, and not just any spending limit. You only get to spend the cash in the bank, period, at all points in time, not just annually, not just quarterly. Literally have a definition, no spending except what you get in cash flow from taxes. Now you're probably going to say, well, how the heck do you do that? Sometimes the cash flow is coming, sometimes it's not. The obligations, even legitimate ones, are going to outstrip that volatility. How do you fix that problem? Easy. What do businesses do? Do businesses always meet payroll all the time with the cash that they got from selling their goods or services? No. Wise businesses have a revolving line of credit to smooth out those volatility problems. One of the things that we've discovered at the Goldwater Institute and with sister organizations and talking to experts around the country is that, ironically, if you want a non-gameable balance of limiting only spending to what you got, you need a revolving line of credit to handle volatility. So debt is not evil. There is a proper role for debt in a system, and that is to handle cash flow volatility. Now there's also another need for debt. What about wars, where there's a sudden need to spend more than what you can possibly bring in taxes? You need to have the capacity, when you're truly borrowing for the sake of future generations, to borrow for the sake of future generations. But do you want Congress to be the one to interpret that loophole? The same addict that is clearly not going to tie its own hands? No. So what you do is you take the whole debt limit debate out of Congress. You require what we require of school boards in most states. Think about it. We don't trust our school boards to issue bonds on their own trust, right? We even at the school level, most states have referendums to make sure that the debtor is not setting his own credit limit, right? What would be more natural than to reintroduce the states into a supervisory role and have a referendum of the states on any proposed increase in the debt limit? Think about it. This goes back to the original design of the Constitution when the states controlled the U.S. Senate, controlled indeed half of the entire legislative power of the national government. So this is a very modest reintroduction of the states. We're targeting the states to a very narrow problem area. And we're not taking away anyone's vote for a senator. We also need to stop the game of chicken. You know, every year we come up to a debt limit. Well, when there is one, right now there is none. They've a suspended bid. But when there was a debt limit, we always get up to this game of chicken, and everybody's panicking, and then they build a crescendo, and then whoop, look at that, the debt limit got lifted or suspended. We've got to stop that. Not only because it damages our credit rating, which matters, it matters, because we do, remember, need some debt somehow. We need it for wars, crises, and we need it for cash flow volatility problems. Well, how do we build a structure to avoid the game of chicken if we have a debt limit? It's actually not too hard. What we've done is we said that when you're within 98% of the debt limit, the president has to start designating impoundments. What are impoundments? Delays in spending, reprioritizations in spending. Okay? What's 98% of the debt limit? Well, if we pass this thing within 3 years, it probably would give us 6 months before hitting the debt limit. 98% at current spending and borrowing rates. Okay? So what we've done is we've said that when you're within 6 months of hitting that debt limit, the president needs to lay his cards on the table, saying, look, if we don't raise that debt limit, here's the 45% of the budget that I'm going to delay. 45% sequestered, because we're borrowing 45 cents on nearly every dollar we spend, right? So he lays it out on the table. Congress then gets 30 days to respond with equal or greater cuts or impoundments. Now, the goal is not necessarily to enforce a 45% sequester. The point is to force the cards on the table, to clarify what is at stake 6 months out, and to force the political class in Washington to start thinking about fixing that problem. Are they going to cut spending? Are they going to try to get more taxes? Are they going to just ask the states for an increase in the debt limit and just kick the can yet again? The point is to clarify with specifics, not vague threats, and to put everyone's name on what the solution will have to be if the debt limit remains in place. 6 months to fix that problem, everyone will see it coming, we'll finally get a solution. Now you're probably going to say, what about Tax-mageddon? Surely the first thing they'll do is raise taxes and just destroy the economy to fix this problem. Now, first of all, let's back up. What is debt if we intend to repay it? Where do we get it out of fairy dust? If we intend to repay debt, it is taxes. Having unlimited debt is unlimited taxes. Having a debt limit is a tax limit, right? So the reality is, constraining the debt is a tax restraint. That's what it is. And it's probably the most morally justifiable tax constraint, because who are we protecting? Unrepresented future generations. In other words, what are we doing with the debt limit? We're stopping taxation without representation, the very principle our country was founded on. So let's first seize the high ground and recognize that the right thing to do, under any circumstance, no matter what the risk may be of raising taxes to end limitless borrowing, the right thing to do is to limit the debt. That is wrong to have a system in place that spirals out of control like it has. It's unsustainable. It will crash. There's no way it can persist. But that being said, we don't want to destroy our seed corn, right? I mean, if you overdo the taxation, you're going to destroy the capacity to handle any debt. So you need to have a compromise. You need to make sure you're not sacrificing future generations, you're not sacrificing current generations. You've got to find a middle ground. And better yet, one that can sell in 38 states, which is going to be hard. Well, here's the first thing we do. We say, let's have a supermajority vote of Congress on any new or increased income or sales or VAT tax, whatever they can dream of. Okay? Supermajority based on the whole number of each house, which is even better than a supermajority of a quorum. 2/3 of the whole number. That's higher than what they require for proposing an amendment. Okay? And the left is going to go, no! So, we've got to compromise. Well, let's compromise in a way that doesn't violate any principles. That is an incrementalist compromise. Here's the compromise. You preserve the current rule of simple majorities for completely replacing out the income tax with a consumption-based end-user sales tax, not a VAT. So you go to the fair tax. You can do that with simple majorities, raise revenues if you do that. Or you can eliminate any deduction, credit, or exemption you want. Again, simple majorities. Now this in no way makes the system worse than it currently is. This can all happen right now. But it preserves the possibility through simple majorities to raise revenues. Now I want you to think about the political dynamics that this creates. Who here saw 300? Or know the story of 300, of Spartans holding back the Persians, right? Where are we pushing to fight for more revenues? If you create this exception to the supermajority rule, where are you channeling it? You're channeling it to a narrow gap where you can get maximum special interest pushback. It may actually be harder to get simple majorities behind that kind of revenue increase than to get supermajorities behind a new tax altogether because of the political dynamics. But more importantly, and I don't know if that's true or not, I just don't know, but it could be harder. But more importantly, we know this. If you're able to overcome that special interest pushback in that narrow gap, what does that tell you about political consensus? It tells you that this truly must be an absolutely necessary revenue increase, right? To overcome that, the people fighting for their home deduction. If you can overcome that politically, that means there probably is a case to be made that, we should stop taxing our kids. And maybe we take a little bit on the chin now. So this is a principled compromise that allows for the possibility of increased revenues, but at the price of a flatter code, a fairer code. And it's structured in such a way as to give much more incentive to cut spending. It's going to be a lot easier to use simple majorities to cut spending. So overall, this amendment will skew the debate towards less spending and only truly necessary revenue increases. Now let me ask you this. Who thinks this is something Congress would ever propose? Show of hands. What? All right. Well, that's why we got to have Article 5. That's why the state origination of amendments is the only way to go. Now, in this part of the presentation, I'm just going to show you why we need a compact to do it. Because, that's all well and good to say the states will do it, the states can do it. But Patrick Henry and George Mason and others rejected the Constitution. They rejected it, they hated it, they said no more with this. It's a ruse, it's a fraud. And here's why they said it. To them, it was critically important for the states to have a usable amendment power, to rebalance the power that they believed was overly centralized in Washington. And they looked at Article 5 with only 13 states, and they said, this is crazy. Nobody's going to get through that process. 2/3 of each legislature, convention, and 3/4 have to ratify. Well, think about what this means with 50 states. You're going to have over 100 legislative acts. Don't believe me? You have 34 state applications, resolutions passed by at least simple majorities. In places like Alaska, case law requires presentment to the governor. You got to have a congressional call, another resolution. Now, Congress is ordered by the Constitution to call the convention. Can we assume Congress will do its constitutional duty? No. Assuming the convention is called, then the states have to populate it. That means at least 26 states have to pass delegate appointment legislation. Assuming the convention does anything, now think about the dynamics of the convention as wide open. A historical opportunity to grandstand. Do you think it would ever end? I mean, would they ever want to end that? Right? I don't think, the greatest risk of the convention is not a runaway convention, in the sense of generating bad amendments. The worst convention would be one that just never ends, because the spotlight's on it forever. And they just stay there, and they fight, and so, but assuming they generate something, then it's got to go back to Congress. Again, Congress has to refer it out. That takes, again, simple majority votes, a resolution. Then you got to go back to the states. You got to get 38 ratifications. Now, mind you, 38 ratifications can take place by way of legislative resolution, so we get 38 pieces of legislation, or it can be in-state conventions. Not every state still has live convention laws that structure the convention yet. So it could be several more pieces of legislation. So this is nuts. At least that's what Patrick Henry said when there were only 13 states. He said this was a fraud. I think Patrick Henry had a practical point. Now that practical point is diminished to some extent with modern technology. We can do things today, and frankly, even with fax machines and snail mail, Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan got to within 2 states of the first threshold in the 1980s. So we can do things with Skype and email that makes this more plausible. But let's not kid ourselves. Is this easy? Is this something we can get done in 3 years? Really? I've got a better approach. And it's not just me. This is a collaboration with Senior Judge Harold DeMoss of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Quick story. I'd written a thought balloon for Liberty and Law about using a compact to fix Article 5. Didn't know what I was talking about yet. I said, well, couldn't we do a compact? Can we have an agreement somehow? Calls me up and goes, Dranias. I go, yes, Judge. He goes, you got a compact like that? I go, what do you mean? I haven't figured it out yet. He goes, oh, I want one. at least for the next couple of months, we kind of tooled it out and figured it out. So here's what it is. First, you have a state agreement, a compact. 2 overarching pieces of legislation to encapsulate the whole process. Then you have a counterpart congressional resolution. In the compact, you have the proposed amendment fully fleshed out, in this case the BBA. In the compact, you create a commission that will run the logistics of the whole thing, because that's a problem. You have a lot of states to organize. In the compact, you'll have the application required by Congress, required by the Constitution. You will use a conditional enactment that says that application goes live only when 38 states join the compact. Why 38 instead of 34? Because what's the point if we can't get it done? Right? Why start something you don't know you can finish? When the application goes live in the congressional resolution, it triggers the call. The call goes live. When the call goes live, the delegates are appointed, already pre-designated in the compact. Convention rules are pre-designated in the compact. The delegates are required to vote them into place as the first order of business. Pre-designating the compact is scope limitations, binding all 38 states to only ratifying the BBA it contemplates and nothing else, and further voiding out anything else that might happen. When the BBA is proposed, if it's proposed, it then triggers in the congressional resolution the ratification referral. When that triggers, it triggers the ratification that's preloaded in the compact. Again, using the magic of a conditional enactment that says it only goes live if it's indeed something that's proposed by the convention, referred out by Congress, boom. Now that might be a little bit oversold, but we've taken this from a 100+ legislative quest to something that can get done in 38 enactments in the states and 1 resolution of Congress. In principle, you can campaign this in a single year. Which would you rather do? Now, here are the benefits of a compact. There are legitimate questions raised by Article 5. Rules, who's going, where's it going to be? Everything's in there. One of the things we did with this compact is we actually invited our opponents for several months for peer review. I reached out to the Eagle Forum. They sent me Andy Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly's son. For 2 to 3 months, we went back and forth on emails, tweaking it, incorporating multiple safeguards. Every last safeguard he wanted, we included. For no other reason than we could. I mean, why not? If you can do it, why not? I mean, that's not my, I'm not here to judge. If you got fantasies and conspiracies and you think that, horrible things will happen, worse than the status quo, I'm not going to judge that. I'm not going to judge that. Tell me what you want. We'll put it in the compact. Now, one of the most important features of the compact, by the way, is not these various safeguards. It's the staging of the process. Let me emphasize that the commission that it organizes goes live with 2 states. Nothing gets done until 38 states and Congress join in passing their respective resolutions. So you have no risk of anything happening until there's an overwhelming political consensus behind this process. And we've even got a 7-year sunset, so if we don't get this thing done in 7 years, it goes away. This makes sure that every political force that matters in the country, as much as it can be mustered in a realistic way, is mustered. That, to me, is the most important thing. And what's important about the commission going live with 2 states involved is that it may draw a fight in the courts at that point. I welcome that fight if it comes. Because that means long before we get to the point of the convention, we can have the courts iron out all the legal issues and make sure that it's worth the push. Chances are they aren't going to bring the fight, because this is well designed. So it doesn't get any safer than this. And mind you, the test is not perfect safety, right? The test is, are we materially increasing the risk of our political system beyond the status quo? Because here's the thing folks need to recognize. Right now, we have a standing constitutional convention in Washington. Does the Constitution mean anything to the folks in Washington? No. So right now, the reality is, every day that Congress meets, the President grabs his pen, we have a constitutional convention. Every single day. And it's been that way for at least 70 years. Some would argue 200 years. Thomas Jefferson, probably say 216, maybe 220 years. I mean, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by John Adams to throw Thomas Jefferson in jail for speaking freely. Come on. So the reality is that we have a constitutional convention. It is called Washington, D.C. It is ongoing. It is unlimited. It is unstoppable if we continue to center power in Washington. The only chance we have
as advocates of limited government, to minimize that runaway convention is to re-empower the states, to organize the states, to focus the states, to bring the fight here, to build the political will here, to mass that will and win the ultimate debate in Washington. And here's where I want to leave you with the last observation about the compact. There's a dirty little secret in Article 5 that Patrick Henry always pointed to. He said Congress. He said Congress. He said Congress. And what are you saying? Think about it. Who has two choke point control levers in this? Congress. It controls the call. It controls the ratification of the vote. Right? I mean, it's supposed to play along. It's ordered to play along. It's in the Constitution. Right? Just like the executive is supposed to faithfully execute the laws. Right? So there's a problem with Article 5 that we all have to recognize. It's Congress. So how do we make sure Congress does the right thing? Here's how. First, you create an institution. That's why we use a compact. That's why we create a commission. You create an institution to fight an institution. We don't want to be that guy in Tiananmen Square. Man versus tank. Guess who wins? We want to have tank versus tank. We don't want to let Congress fill any of the logistical voids. Because a smart Congress isn't going to say no to a call. Here's what a smart Congress would do. A smart Congress would say, hey, that's a great idea. Let's organize a mini Congress with a lower amendment threshold. Why, we'll just populate it with people elected from our congressional districts. Ooh, I wonder who that would be. We know that's what Congress is going to do. Why? Because they've already passed bills in the 70s and in the 80s to do just that. And I can send them to you. So the congressional response to the Article 5 effort, if you don't have a compact that occupies all the logistical spaces, will be, great idea. Here's our plan. So you got to force a choice. A political choice is clearly defined that doesn't allow wiggle room. The good thing is the compact resolution only requires simple majorities. And because it's a consent to a compact, it doesn't require presidential presentment. Here's the other thing. Remember that little secret sauce, the conditional enactment? How things go live only at the right time? We built those into the congressional resolution as well. You can run the congressional resolution at any time. It will lay dormant until the right thing happens in the states, and then be triggered. Sure, it could be repealed, but it's easier to defend than to pass. So we get to choose when to run the congressional consent. We get to choose anytime there's a line, a hole in the line to run it through. That tactical flexibility is really meaningful because just about every serious balanced budget proposal ever originated from Congress got at least simple majorities. So there is a hole in the line that we can count on. Now you're probably going to ask, what about all the other Article 5 efforts? Okay. There are at least two other major efforts. You have the BBA task force that's trying to pick up where Reagan and Friedman left off. You've got the Convention of States that are trying to create a whole new application with a wide agenda of just limiting the federal government generally. These are not mutually exclusive efforts. Obviously, I have a preference. But here's the one weak spot about the compact. It isn't a mystery. It's not a pig in a poke. You do know exactly what you're going to get. So it's either going to sell or it's not going to sell. Right? Just like a ballot measure in states that have ballot measures. It's either going to sell or it's not going to sell. I'm not guaranteeing this is going to sell. I'm saying it's well crafted, it's poll tested. It should sell. It may not sell. So there is a disadvantage to fully defining the product. It may not sell. By contrast, the BBA task force just wants a drafting convention. Don't know when we're going to get anything ratified. They don't care. I mean, they just want to have a convention that's focused. So that's a good backup plan. If it turns out that having a specific idea doesn't sell. And if having a BBA is just not sexy anymore. I mean, Senator Rand Paul keeps saying we don't want to talk about fiscal issues anymore. I don't know why. It seems to be a natural place for us to be, but apparently it's not cool. If he turns out he's right, it's not cool to talk about balanced budget amendments anymore. Maybe the NSA issue is more cool. Well, then maybe the Convention of States wider approach makes more sense. So these are backup plans. We should diversify our risks. I'm all in favor of all three, but I'm focusing on the first. Because one of the things I believe, having been an attorney for 16 years and in the think tank world for 8, is that it's better to have a product to sell than an idea. that it's intrinsically difficult to say, let's build it and the amendments will come. It's not a bad thing if the only alternative is to default on our debt and watch the government go into a tyranny. I mean, I'd certainly go for that as an alternative. But we have, I think, a more rational way to go. So, in the end, we're left with the fear-mongering. And I don't know how much time we have left, but...
You get questions.
Okay. I will save the following slides, which have great information about what the founders intended us to do with Article 5, all of which will convince you, if you have a question, that Article 5 is perfectly safe and was intended to be used. And with that said, thank you so much for your time.